The morning air in Largefield, Alabama, was still heavy with dew when Calvin Rhodes stepped out of the county jail's side entrance. His suit was wrinkled, his tie slightly loosened, and his polished shoes bore the faint trace of dust kicked up from the holding cell's concrete floor. He said nothing to the deputy who handed back his briefcase, just nodded once, a quiet, composed gesture of a man who had not been broken, only paused. Across the parking lot, the courthouse loomed, small and stately in the way only rural buildings could be, designed more for ceremony than for comfort. Inside, the courtroom was already stirring with low conversation, laughter, and the familiar shuffling of papers and feet. Officer Daniel Corbin, who had made the arrest, sat smugly on the witness bench, recounting last night's incident to his colleague, Sergeant Rick Delaney, in a tone somewhere between a joke and a boast. "I told him to step out," Corbin grinned, and he started talking about protocol like he was somebody. Didn't even raise his voice, just stood there like I was beneath him. Delaney chuckled. "Bet he sings a different tune today." They all do. The courtroom doors creaked open and Calvin entered, his pace unhurried. He carried no entourage, no attorney, just a thin, weathered briefcase and a calm presence that made some heads turn, though not for the reasons they should have. To most in the room, he looked like just another middle-aged black man caught in a system too large to bend. The room didn't see the quiet certainty in his stride, the unwavering steadiness in his eyes. They didn't notice the subtle detail of his cufflinks, brass, embossed with a federal seal almost no one in this room would recognize. They didn't see Calvin Rhodes, the man who had trained hundreds of agents in federal oversight, led multi-state investigations into systemic abuse, and sat on the very commission that wrote the handbook Officer Corbin had violated last night. No, they saw a man who didn't belong in that courtroom except as a defendant. Judge Elena Brunner glanced at the docket with tired eyes. She'd seen enough small-town misdemeanor cases to know the rhythm. Plea, fine, next. This one wouldn't be different until it was. Case 247B, State of Alabama versus Calvin Rhodes, the bailiff called. Calvin stepped forward. The murmur subsided. Corbin straightened. Delaney folded his arms, smirking. "Mr. Rhodes," Judge Brunner began, "you've been charged with obstruction of a traffic stop and failure to comply with police directives. Do you understand these charges?" "I do," Calvin said, his voice even, warm, and oddly unshaken. "Do you have legal representation?" "No, Your Honor," he replied, unfolding a single document from his briefcase. "But I'd like to submit an identification affidavit and accompanying verification for the court's record." She raised an eyebrow, then gestured for the clerk. Calvin handed the paper forward. Corbin snorted under his breath. "Here we go. Sovereign Citizen Act." But the room shifted the moment the judge's gaze landed on the heading. U.S. Department of Justice Office of Federal Integrity Oversight, Clearance Level, Tier 1, Authorization. Her hands stilled. The court clerk leaned in and whispered something eyes wide. The judge looked back at Calvin. "Mr. Rhodes," she said carefully, "please clarify your role." He reached into his briefcase again and calmly produced a second item, a slim Navy credential wallet. Opening it with quiet precision, he held it up for the room to see. The badge inside gleamed. Federal Oversight Director, U.S. Department of Justice gasps echoed like the crack of wood on stone. Corbin froze. Delaney dropped his folded arms. The court went utterly still. "I'm not here to play a role," Calvin said, his voice still calm. "I'm here because last night 2 of your officers made a decision, not based on law, not on threat, but on assumption, one that happens far more than it should." He looked directly at Corbin, then at the judge. "And I documented all of it. The room didn't know it yet, but in less than 12 hours, everything about Larchfield's justice system was about to unravel." The silence that followed Calvin Rhodes's quiet declaration wasn't ordinary. It didn't settle into the room, it sank, heavy and irreversible. The kind of silence that forces people to confront what they'd been too comfortable ignoring. Judge Elena Brunner broke it first. "I'm calling a 10-minute recess," she said, her voice low but firm. "All officers involved in this case are to remain present. Bailiff, please clear the gallery except for counsel and essential personnel." As murmurs swelled and people began rising, Officer Corbin shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The smirk was gone. His face, now a pale shade of disbelief, flicked between Calvin and the courtroom doors, like a man watching the walls close in. Sergeant Delaney, too, suddenly seemed to age in his uniform. He glanced at Corbin, eyes darting, calculating. Outside the courtroom, the air felt colder. Calvin stood near the hallway window, watching the courthouse lawn. His briefcase was closed now, hands at rest. But inside, his mind was processing like a computer stacked with encrypted files, not anger, resolution. There was a difference. Judge Brunner approached him quietly, paper still in hand. "Director Rhodes," she said, this time using his full title with the gravity that hadn't existed just 15 minutes prior. "Why didn't you announce your position earlier?" Calvin turned, his voice steady. "Because I shouldn't have to." Brunner nodded slowly. It wasn't just an answer, it was a warning dressed as a truth. By the time the courtroom reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted. The seats were sparse. A handful of clerks typed more carefully. The two officers now looked like guests at their trial. Calvin took the stand, formally this time. "I was driving through Larchfield en route to a private oversight audit of the county's complaint review process," he began. "I'd received anonymous reports of irregularities regarding how traffic stops involving minorities were documented, or more accurately, not documented." He glanced down at a thin tablet and continued. "I was not operating in undercover capacity. My vehicle is registered to the DOJ. I was not speeding. I signaled. I complied fully." He paused. "What I did not do was defer to intimidation." He tapped the screen and slid it toward the clerk. A soft chime confirmed file transfer. "This is a time-stamped audio log of the encounter, recorded through my DOJ-issued device." The clerk blinked, then passed it to the judge. She clicked play. The courtroom filled with the unmistakable click of boots on pavement. Corbin's voice crackled to life, too loud, too sharp. "License, now. May I ask the nature of—" "Out of the car. Step out, right now." There were no raised voices from Calvin, no threats, just questions, and calm refusals to escalate. But the tone from Corbin and Delaney, that tone was poison in surround sound. When the clip ended, the silence returned, but now it burned. Judge Brunner exhaled. "This evidence is overwhelming." Corbin stood suddenly. "Your Honor, this man never identified himself. He was evasive." "Officer," she cut in, "he didn't have to. Your job is not to guess who someone might be to treat them lawfully." She turned back to Calvin. "Director Rhodes, what would you have this court do?" Calvin hesitated, then stood, not behind the podium, not before the bench, just in the center of the room, unshielded. "This isn't about me," he said quietly. "I can walk out of here and call the Deputy Attorney General in 3 minutes. I'll be fine." He looked directly at the officers. "But what about the next person? The young man who doesn't have a badge to flash or a recording device on his lapel? What happens when his word is the only one in the room and the room doesn't want to hear it?" No one spoke. Even the stenographer had stopped typing, caught in the moment. "I have formally filed for a federal review of Larchfield PD," Calvin said. "The Department of Justice has authorized an emergency ethics audit to begin within 72 hours, and I'll be staying in town to oversee it." You could almost hear the breath catch in Delaney's throat. Calvin turned to Judge Brunner. "I appreciate the court's time." Then, without waiting for applause or acknowledgement, he returned to his seat and gathered his things. Judge Brunner's gavel struck once, louder than necessary. This court is adjourned. And may I add, she paused, looking at Corbin and Delaney. Some people wear badges because they earn them. Others believe the badge permits them to forget who they are. Today, we saw the difference. As people exited the courtroom in stunned silence, only one thing was clear. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something much, much bigger. By the next morning, Larchfield was no longer a sleepy town ignored by most maps. News vans lined the courthouse steps like vultures sensing the scent of scandal. Microphones waited, cameras rolled, and inside the mayor's office, phones ringing off the hook with calls from reporters, legal advocates, and higher-ups in Montgomery and D.C. But Calvin Rhodes didn't grant interviews. Not yet. He was seated quietly inside the police archives room, fluorescent lights flickering overhead, a stack of brittle manila folders in front of him. His face, calm but unreadable, scanned each page with the precision of a surgeon. By his side sat Agent Tessa Monroe, a DOJ field investigator with eyes as sharp as Calvin's were steady. "What are we looking for exactly?" she asked, her voice low. Calvin didn't look up. "Patterns, not incidents, habits. Look for cases dismissed without a formal record. Look for names that appear more than once, with no escalation." Tessa nodded. Within an hour, the pattern began to emerge, like ink slowly bleeding through a page. Dozens of traffic stops, mostly black drivers. Charges dropped. No official complaints filed, no body cam footage logged, no internal review. But one file made Calvin stop completely. Case ID 19C276. Complainant, Lillian Haynes. Incident type, uncooperative civilian. Outcome, verbal warning issued. He pulled the file closer. The incident report was 2 sentences long. The name of the responding officer? R. Delaney. "Do you know who this is?" he asked Tessa. Tessa glanced over. "Haynes. Wasn't that the woman in the courtroom gallery yesterday?" Calvin nodded slowly. "She was watching the hearing the whole time. She never blinked. Like she knew more than she said." Later that day, Calvin knocked gently on the front door of a modest white cottage on Sycamore Street. The porch creaked under his feet. An old wind chime trembled in the breeze. Lillian Haynes opened the door slowly, eyes narrowing, then softening when she recognized him. "I knew you'd come," she said, her voice raspy but clear. "May I?" Calvin asked. She stepped aside. Inside, the living room smelled of eucalyptus and old paperbacks. Family portraits lined the mantel, smiling faces, generations captured in Sunday best. But beneath the warmth, something lingered, a silence too practiced to be comfort. "I filed a complaint 4 years ago," Lillian began. "They said I cursed at an officer. Said I was non-compliant. All I did was ask why they slammed my niece against a patrol car when she dropped her school bag." Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. "They told me to leave. When I refused, he shoved me. Hard. I fell, cracked a rib. The report said I tripped over my cane." Tessa sat beside her, taking notes. "Why didn't you go public?" Calvin asked gently. Lillian looked at him, eyes wet but steady. "Because people like me know what happens when we talk. We don't get listened to. We get labeled. Or worse." She paused. "But yesterday, when you stood up there and said what you said, I thought maybe this time it's different." Calvin nodded slowly. "It is." By the end of the week, more people came forward. Former students, postal workers, and retirees. Their stories are almost identical in rhythm. Stops with no cause. Force with no consequence. Voices met with smirks and silence. Calvin compiled every testimony, every mismatch report, every missing file. On Friday morning, he delivered it in a sealed case file to Judge Brunner's chambers. This is more than a personnel issue, he said. It's systemic. The leadership isn't just negligent, it's complicit. The judge opened the first folder, brows furrowing. How far up does it go? Far enough, Calvin answered. But I'm not after heads, I'm after roots. This town doesn't need a scapegoat. It needs a new blueprint. Later that evening, a press conference was held in the town square. Mayor Clarkson stood stiffly at the podium, flanked by state officials and a solemn-faced police chief. But it was Calvin who approached the microphone last. He didn't deliver a fiery speech. He didn't call out names. Instead, he held up Mrs. Haynes' original complaint file, now enlarged on the projector behind him. This, he said, is not a document. It's a warning label. It tells you what happens when a system assumes power means immunity. It tells you that silence isn't neutral, it's chosen, and that some people in this town have been choosing it for far too long. A hush fell over the crowd, then applause, quiet, then building. Not the applause of celebration, but the kind that comes when people recognize truth in its most painful, most unflinching form. Calvin Rhodes stepped back from the podium. In Larchfield, for the first time in a long time, leaned forward to listen. By Monday, the air in Larchfield felt heavier, not because of heat, but the weight of too many secrets dragged into sunlight. Within the Larchfield Police Department, officers walked quietly. Doors were half closed now during meetings. No one left reports unattended, and whispers about Rhodes and federal audit curled through the hallways like smoke no one dared to inhale too deeply. But behind a locked door on the second floor, Captain Roderick Hale, a 22-year veteran of the force, sat grim-faced as he watched a grainy, time-stamped video file. In it, Officer Corbin could be seen slamming a 19-year-old college student against the hood of his car. No resisting, no threat, just panic. The audio crackled with Corbin's voice, layered in profanity and threats. "What is this?" Hale demanded, looking up. Detective Marshia Kilgore, a soft-spoken internal affairs investigator, didn't flinch. Footage from Dashcam 142D, never logged. I found it mislabeled as an equipment test. Hale leaned back, heart pounding. "How many of these do you have?" She placed the folder on the desk. 16. 16 incidents. 16 cover-ups. "Why now?" Hale asked. Marsha's reply was sharp, "Because we're out of places to hide them." That afternoon, Calvin Rhodes stood before a room full of city officials. The long oak table, usually a site of zoning debates and budget talks, now bore a single laptop projecting file after file. Each document carried the same signs: missing timestamps, incomplete arrest records, blank witness fields, and beneath each an officer's signature. Some repeated. Mayor Clarkson tried to maintain control. "Mr. Rhodes, these are serious accusations." "They're not accusations," Calvin said. "They're evidence." He tapped a key. The screen showed the Larchfield PD's complaint log. Dozens of entries labeled "resolved internally" with no explanation. Internal resolution is not justice, he continued, especially when it protects repeat offenders. The same names appear across 5 years, the same patterns, the same silence. City Councilwoman Geneva Holt, long silent during these meetings, finally spoke. "What do you recommend?" Calvin turned to her. "We suspend the officers under investigation, we open sealed cases, and we bring in an external review panel from Montgomery." "You want to dismantle the entire department?" someone muttered. "No," he said quietly. "I want to rebuild it." That evening, Officer Corbin's locker was emptied quietly, but not by Corbin. He had disappeared. The department claimed he'd taken personal leave, but Calvin knew better. He'd seen it before in other towns, other cities. When the pressure built, some didn't wait to be held accountable. They ran. but the cracks were spreading faster than anyone could plug them. The next day, an anonymous email hit every major newsroom in Alabama. Subject line, Larchfield cover-ups run deeper than you think. Attachment, a 78-page document, internal memos, redacted civilian complaints, a voice memo allegedly featuring Sergeant Rick Delaney boasting, "You think the feds scare me? I got friends on every bench in this state. We bury things here." The leak set off a storm. State senators called emergency hearings. The governor ordered an expedited audit, and national networks finally picked up the story. Calvin sat quietly in his hotel room that night, phone buzzing nonstop. Texts from DOJ officials, requests from CNN, offers for interviews. But he stared at only one thing, a message from Lillian Haynes. "You didn't just speak, you stayed." That's what made it different. Meanwhile, within the department, panic had turned into resistance. A faction of officers, older, hardened, fiercely loyal to the system as it was, began whispering about retaliation. Some demanded the mayor push back against federal interference. Others suggested Calvin was planting evidence. Detective Marshia Kilgore overheard one of them say, "He might have come here with power, but this town doesn't take kindly to outsiders pulling strings." She reported it directly to Hale. "We're not just dealing with misconduct anymore," she said. "We're dealing with denial weaponized." The next morning, as Calvin walked up the courthouse steps for a closed-door ethics hearing, a local reporter approached him. "Director Rhodes," she asked, "do you believe the resistance inside the department threatens the audit's integrity?" He paused. "I believe justice always faces resistance. The difference," he said, "is how loud that resistance becomes when silence no longer protects them." And with that, he stepped inside. Unbeknownst to him, at that very moment, a desperate officer was making a phone call to a state judge, once a close ally of Delaney, a final effort to protect the old guard. But what none of them knew was this: another voice was about to enter the conversation. Someone from Calvin's past, someone with power, leverage, and a long memory. And they weren't coming to protect Larchfield. They were coming to expose it. The Larchfield courthouse had never seen so many press badges. Lined shoulder to shoulder, reporters spilled into the square outside, their lenses pointed at a building that had long concealed its cracks behind tradition and polite indifference. But not today. Inside, Federal Integrity Chief Calvin Rhodes sat poised behind the witness table. His gray suit was impeccable, but it wasn't power that commanded the room. It was stillness. The kind of stillness that came from seeing too much and losing patience with excuses. Across the aisle sat Sergeant Rick Delaney, flanked by two attorneys, lips tight, eyes flat. Behind him, Officer Corbin had finally reappeared, his expression unreadable, but the tremble in his right leg betrayed more than he'd say aloud. The courtroom was tense until the doors opened one final time. A woman walked in, cane in hand, steady as stone. Lillian Haynes. She took a seat in the front row. Judge Elena Brunner nodded at the bailiff. "Call your next witness." And then, quietly, without fanfare, the unexpected happened. Senator Darius Cole, chairman of the State Judiciary Oversight Committee, entered from a side door. Murmurs rippled like wind through dry grass. Calvin rose, visibly surprised. The senator, once his mentor, took the podium. "I'm not here to testify," Cole said. "I'm here to deliver a statement from the office of the governor in the U.S. Attorney's Office." He opened a small folder, then read, "Effective immediately, the Larchfield Police Department is under state receivership. All officers currently under investigation are suspended without pay. A task force will be formed, co-led by Federal Integrity Director Rhodes, to restructure the department from the ground up." Gasps broke out. Brunner held up her gavel but didn't strike it. She allowed the sound to linger, truth echoing where silence once reigned. Senator Cole looked up. "This is not punishment. This is restoration." In the days that followed, everything changed. Delaney resigned under pressure. Corbin was indicted on 2 counts of civil rights violations. Mayor Clarkson announced she would not seek re-election. But most notably, Officer Marshia Kilgore, the quiet IA detective, was named interim chief of Larchfield PD. The town had never had a black woman in that role. They had never had someone who spoke so little and saw so much. On a chilly Wednesday morning, a new sign was installed at the entrance of the precinct. Larchfield PD, reformed in truth, led by integrity. Calvin stood beside it, watching the crew work. Lillian Haynes approached slowly, her cane tapping softly on the concrete. "They're not going to forget this," she said. "No," Calvin replied, "and that's the point." He turned toward her. "We don't rebuild systems to make people forget. We rebuild so they remember better." She nodded, then added, with a glint in her eyes, "My niece said she wants to be a civil rights lawyer now. I think she just needed to see someone win for once." Later that month at a law enforcement reform summit in Montgomery, Calvin was asked on stage what surprised him most about the Larchfield case. He paused for a moment, then answered, "It wasn't the corruption. Sadly, I've seen worse. What surprised me was how long people were willing to let truth rot in silence, until one act of disrespect woke them up. It took one slap, not to awaken a judge, but to awaken a system that thought it was untouchable. The slap wasn't the crime. The crime was how many slaps had gone unseen before it." The audience stood in silence, not out of formality, but respect. Moral of the story: this story wasn't about a powerful man teaching officers a lesson. It was about the quiet ones, the dismissed, the elderly, the unheard, finding their voices again when someone finally stayed long enough to listen. It was about dignity without spectacle, power without performance, and truth without vengeance. Sometimes the most powerful man in the room isn't the loudest. Sometimes justice arrives not as a roar, but as a whisper followed by action. And sometimes when a system refuses to change, it only takes one wrong target to make it all unravel. That's not revenge. That's accountability.